Welcome to episode 67 of the Fearless Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Herron, coming to you from the high five state of Michigan, broadcasting from my favorite church, Life Church. You can find us online at lifechurchmichigan.com. Today's episode of the Fearless Leadership Podcast is brought to you by the all-new Church Growth Network. When you go to churchgrowth.network, you'll discover how to throw out your old playbook and discover that the new normal requires you to make a leadership shift. The all-new Church Growth Network offers 9 months of coaching, one-on-one, once a month on the phone, 60 minutes of live teaching every month via Zoom, the new Double Your Church digital course, an online vault of leadership resources, the Breaking 200 training series, and so much more. So are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling stuck? Are you discouraged at the end of 2021? Make 2022 the year that your church doubles in size. The Church Growth Network, online at www.churchgrowth.network. All right, gang, episode 67, last episode of the year, 2021. I can't believe it's going to be 2022. My mind is still disoriented and wrapped around dealing with 2020. I don't know about the rest of you. I feel like we still have a 2020 hangover, but things are on the up and up. I'm not concerned about this new variant of the virus. I've already gotten all my shots. I'm boosted up. I got my flu shot. I'm a walking vaccine, people. And I just don't want to get sick. I want to be effective in leading our organization and in helping you, equipping you with principles from comedy to connect through comedy. That's the whole big idea of the Fearless Leadership Podcast. It's asking the question, what would you do if you weren't afraid anymore? And have a huge announcement coming up at the end of the podcast about the future of the Fearless Leadership Podcast. You don't want to miss that. But for today's show, since this is it for the year, and we cranked out 21 episodes this year, we're going to do a year-end mailbag. We've never done this before, but we have just some amazing folks, amazing leaders like you who send in Facebook messages and emails, and really appreciate that. That is great to hear about what is happening in your small business, in your organization. Lots of church leaders seem to connect with this podcast. And so we're going to dive into the mailbag and answer some of the questions that have come up. So this is more of a personal episode, I suppose. I do this about once a year where I kind of recap. Here's where I'm at in my life. I don't know about you. I always find these episodes to be cheaper than therapy. So here we go, episode 67, the year-end mailbag. And as we dive into the mailbag, man, I just want to say thank you for being part of this journey. I hope that in some small way you've been able to glean nuggets from this podcast. My heart is just to share what I've experienced and what I've learned. I can definitely tell you what not to do with your organization, but also here are some of the steps of faith. Here's some of the risks, the entrepreneurial methodology that we've grabbed hold of, and high risk, high reward. Here's what we've seen happen. So that's my hope, is that this has been helpful to you and that you'll continue to be a faithful subscriber to the podcast in the future. Okay, first mailbag question comes from Nate. Hi, Nate. Thanks for listening, Nate. Nate is a pastor in a church that's in a denomination, and he's really struggling with the future of his denomination. Not sure that he can stick with it. I get it, man. I get it. I grew up in a small country church in the cornfields of Iowa, surrounded by cattle and pigs. We were part of a mainline denomination, and I was confirmed in the church. I went to college on a scholarship from this denomination. Within 3 years of graduating college, this denomination was having a national debate over whether or not Jesus is Lord, and they couldn't agree on that. And so that's when I said, I'm out of here. I'm not sticking around with the Titanic here. And so I've kind of been on the non-denominational route ever since. But I definitely feel for you. There are pluses and minuses to being in the denominational system. But that's not the thrust of the mailbag question. The big question is about his family working on getting out of debt. And I've talked about that in the past here on the podcast. My wife and I had a ton of school-related debts from our undergrad years and from graduate school. And then a lot of adoption debts. We've adopted 5 times. And as you probably heard, adoption is very expensive. I mean, you can fundraise, you could hold a garage sale, but that's going to be a massive garage sale. So we had a lot of adoption loans. And a couple years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago now, we aggressively paid off all of our debts. And so now we are debt-free. Our cars are paid for. Everything's paid for. We pay cash. We don't have credit cards. So the mailbag question is, as our family is getting serious about getting out of debt, what are some tips you have for getting out of debt? All right. Well, I don't claim to be an expert by any means, and I certainly do not have an education in this area. I'm not a financial expert, but what's helped my wife Amber and I was about 12 years ago, we attended a Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University course. We actually led the course at our church plant in Ohio, and we fell in love with the comedy and delivery style of Dave Ramsey. So we are Dave Ramsey fans. He's plain spoken, very easy to listen to, and it makes sense. And then B, we want to honor God, not just with the Sunday part of our lives, but with our whole lives. And that includes with how we manage God's stuff. So the scriptures say you bring nothing into this world, you take nothing out of this world. Everything belongs to God. It's all God's stuff. And the big idea in the Old Testament was when a king went off to war, he would hand over the stewardship of the royal treasury to a steward, to a manager. And this manager was put in charge of the king's resources, the king's stuff. He was to manage it wisely. He was to actually build interest on the king's treasury so that when the king returned, he could give a positive report of managing the king's stuff well and of multiplying the king's resources. So that's the whole idea of being financially smart. It's biblical. It's a form of worship. And so that was the beginning of our journey. We cut up our credit cards. You do not need a credit card. You don't. You don't need a credit record. You don't. You know what's amazing? When you can pay for things with CASH, cash. Cash is king. So my first tip is don't spend money you don't have, because the debtor is a slave to the lender. That's not just a colloquial saying. That's found in the book of Romans. The debtor is a slave to the lender. And in Romans 13, it says you are to owe nothing to anyone except love. So you don't want to be up to your eyeballs in debt. You want to cut up those cards. You want to start a debt snowball. So you list out all of your debts from smallest to largest, and you begin paying off the small debts right away. Why? Because it's a psychological win. When you can cross off your list, hey, we just paid off that plasma TV that we purchased 15 years ago on our Discover card, and we discovered debt. Paying that off is a win. And then you take those payments and you add it to the next item on your list, and it starts a snowball effect, and it works. We paid off 2 college degrees, 2 graduate degrees, student loans. We paid off 2 cars. We paid off 3 adoption loans, which are just mind-boggling. And it's an amazing feeling the day that you are debt-free, that you don't owe money to people. You're not throwing money in the wind with interest. It's such an amazing feeling. It allows you to become more generous. It reduces stress. It reduces arguments. And Dave Ramsey's team does an excellent job of teaching the biblical principles of getting out of debt. So I'm not paid to, as a spokesman for Ramsey Solutions by any means. We just really believe in the ministry. And so you can Google Dave Ramsey and check out his stuff. And definitely make that your New Year's resolution. You can do it. You can be debt-free. Don't buy the American lie that you have to have a credit card. You don't. It's a horrible chain around your neck. You're sacrificing your future when you have debt. And there's no shame in admitting, hey, I got a lot of debt. I got to deal with this. I respect the man or woman that can own up to, hey, you know what? I did some dumb things. All of us have done dumb things in the past. So let's do something about it, all right? And have a better future, a better tomorrow. That's being fearless right there. So thank you, Nate, for the mailbag question. I hope that's helpful to you, and God's blessings to you as you navigate the cross currents of your denomination. Okay. Jonathan Herron here, episode 67, Fearless Leadership Podcast. A big announcement for you coming up at the end of the podcast you don't want to miss. But we're continuing through the mailbag questions from real listeners, just like you. Next question is a very specific question about the Mark Driscoll episode. All right. I was just talking to someone. I was coaching someone on the phone about an hour ago. I have the privilege of coaching ministry leaders and church planters. And this guy first heard of this podcast because my friend Perry Noble, I guess, posted over the summer a screenshot from this podcast, Fearless Leadership Podcast, an episode that we did over the summer. See if I can find it really quick on the website. I think it was episode 58, where we talked about the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Yep, it was episode number 58, titled Mark Driscoll, Perry Noble, and the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church. In that episode of the podcast, there's a video on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, which you can find just by typing in my name, Jonathan Herron. It quickly became the most downloaded, the most viewed episode of this podcast by far. The comment section kind of blew up. And on YouTube, you can give a thumbs up or thumbs down, and people just went to war over that. So the question is about, have I finished listening to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church? Because that podcast just recently wrapped up in the past week or so. And what were my impressions? Have my impressions changed? So, when I recorded episode 58 back in July, I didn't put a ton of thought into it. It really was a spur of the moment decision, acting on a conviction I felt that the intentions behind this popular podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church, from Christianity Today, I felt like it was failure porn, that it was inflating and sensationalizing a very complex situation. And in particular, my biggest beef, my biggest point of contention that I shared in episode 58 was lumping all of these quote unquote celebrity pastors in the same bunch, of painting with such a wide paintbrush, of saying that Driscoll and Perry Noble and whoever else, fill in the blank, all quote unquote fell from grace for the same reason, when the reality is much more complex, and it's not accurate. It's a disservice to those seeking truth to automatically assume that all of these situations were the same, and they weren't. As Perry has talked about openly in messages, in which I was pointing out in that podcast episode, Perry was suffering from PTSD. He was abused as a child. He had horrible things happen to him in his life, which led him to self-medicate with alcohol. That doesn't excuse his behavior. It's still wrong. It's still sinful. But he got help. And he is clean and sober and in the best health of his life. And so you cannot put Perry Noble's situation in the same category as a Mark Driscoll, for example. So that was what I was saying back in the summer. Since then, I've listened to every episode of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church. Many of the episodes, I cringed. It felt that there were currents of an agenda underneath the storytelling. There was definitely a poor picture painted of a theological stream called complementarianism. So there was an egalitarian viewpoint that was being pushed very robustly. And so that was agenda reporting. That wasn't fair reporting. I will say this. The second to last episode in The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church was by far the best episode. It was solid reporting on the facts. It was accurate. It was shared in a very fair and transparent way. And so if there is an episode of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church that I do think is beneficial for church leaders and for seminaries, it would be the second to last episode. That's a cautionary tale. The very last episode, which was like a movie of the week, it took like longer than Lord of the Rings. I don't know if that was 3 hours, how long it was. That last episode, I was, again, disappointed. Not in the people who shared their experiences and viewpoints. Those stories need to be honored. But I was disappointed in the storytelling by Mike Cosper, the host. There was just a lot of editorializing and jumping to conclusions that were unnecessary and that did a disservice. And so I think at the end of the day, for me, I'm not a fan of the agenda and the point of view of the storytelling in that series of podcasts. That said, it's not something I'm going to die on a hill for. So if you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine, and I honor that. We all come from different experiences, and that's what makes humanity beautiful. We are a mosaic. And it's not a hill I want to die on. I don't want to be known as the guy that criticized the Mark Driscoll podcast, because, yeah, there are things that Mark Driscoll did and is doing currently that I firmly disagree with and that are wrong. But how we disagree and in what public settings, that's where we need to hold up our actions through the lens of Scripture. All right? Great question. Great question. We're doing the year-end mailbag. The year-end mailbag. Mailbag. Do you remember the old Dave Letterman late show? Letters. We get letters. We get lots and lots of letters. Letters. Paul Schaefer. Best band leader ever. The world's most dangerous band. This email comes in from Tim in Ohio. Tim, how you doing, buddy? He asks, how is the doctoral work going? Oh, well, thank you for asking. I've been on this journey, as all of us have been in the post-pandemic world. One of the convictions I've come to in looking at the church in America, including my own church, the church that I love and lead, lifechurchmichigan.com, I believe firmly that a lesson from the COVID shutdowns is that the American church failed to root people in the gospel. And I include myself in that failure. So I'll use myself as an example of the failure. Life Church, one of the fastest growing churches in America. We're 8 years old. We quickly were reaching people far from God. We grew from 0 to 1,200 in 5 years, from 1 campus to 3 campuses. This was all pre-COVID. And then when the shutdown happened, we had to pivot, like everyone else, to digital only, live streaming. And then we had extra hardships that were detailed in a previous episode. What the American church is facing now is what we're also seeing here at Life Church, is that there's a segment of pre-pandemic people who left the church. And they're not coming back. They're not anti-Christ, they're not anti-God. They just got into a new season, a new habit of, sleeping in on Sunday, or, working out on Sunday, or doing something different on Sunday other than being part of the gathering of believers. I can't get mad at them for that. It's a reflection of leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And so I've had to come to terms with, I failed my people. I failed to deeply root them in the gospel. I failed to deeply disciple my people. Because if you are genuinely and passionately following Jesus, you will not walk away from his bride. And so, again, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone except myself. Another book that I've read that's just rocked my world, it's a New York Times bestseller. It's called Extreme Ownership. It's written by a former Navy SEAL, Jocko, who has an uber popular podcast. And the whole idea is that when you are leading men and women into armed combat, life or death situations, the leader owns everything. It's extreme ownership. If the mission succeeds, yay, good leadership. If the mission fails, it's on the leader. It really is. You can't blame people on their training when you were the trainer. And so there's a reckoning there that I've had to come to terms with as a church leader, that we were extremely effective at reaching people far from God, but extremely weak in relationally connecting people to the living God of the universe. And so, of course, when they got out of the habit of going to a physical church facility, they got out of rhythm in their relationship with Jesus. And so that's a long, long story to say that led me in the summer to pursue my doctorate and to study this, to better understand the church's failures, my own failures, and how do we fix that so that it doesn't happen again, because there will be more life-altering crises in the future. There will be another pandemic in the next 100 years, and I don't want people to fall through the cracks again. So I'm pursuing this doctorate through John Rawlings School of Divinity at Liberty University. Believe it or not, I'm going through the aggressive student approach. So I'm loading up my classes. I'm reading like a book a day right now. I'm reading tons of books, attending lots of online lectures, writing lots of papers because I like pain. This is the pro pain schedule. And so now here we are at the end of December 2021, and I'm already halfway through my doctorate, believe it or not. Now that pace is not going to continue in 2022 because I have a family. There's 7 of us, and I want my family to still love each other at the end of this. And I have a church that needs me. And so I'll be stretching out and slowing down my courses coming up in January 2022. And looks like probably if everything progresses without any hiccups, I should hoping to earn a doctorate in the spring of 2023. And then you can call me Dr. John, and that'll be cool. I'll sound like an old blues jazz singer from Chicago. Dr. John, you're on the air with Dr. John. And pursuing my doctorate in evangelism and church planting, and trying to understand within the church startup as an entrepreneur, how do we marry the idea of reaching people far from God with deeply discipling people who have begun following Christ. So thank you, Tim from Ohio, for asking about that. Working hard, reading a ton, and it's fun. I love learning. Leaders are learners. When you stop learning, you stop leading. When you stop reading, you stop leading. Okay, we're in the mailbag, the year-end mailbag. One last email, and then I have a big announcement for all of you all. Once again, thank you to our sponsors. Today's episode of the Fearless Leadership Podcast is brought to you by the all-new Church Growth Network, www.churchgrowth.network. It is a 9-month coaching program with no egos, no comparison games, no swagger or rejection. You already feel stuck. You already feel frustrated and discouraged. Throw out your old playbook. The new normal requires you to make a leadership shift. Join the Church Growth Network at churchgrowth.network. A 9-month membership has advantages: 30 minutes of personal coaching every month, 60 minutes of live training via Zoom with church leaders every month, the new Double Your Church digital course, access to our online vault of leadership resources, Breaking 200 video training series, How to Raise 30K in 30 Days toolkit, and so much more. It's the all-new Church Growth Network. 50% off right now when you use the coupon code FEARLESS at checkout. Go to www.churchgrowth.network and use the coupon code FEARLESS for 50% off your 9-month subscription for their coaching program. The year-end mailbag. Here we go. The final question in the mailbag. And thank you for connecting, gang. You can always connect on social media at High Five John, at High Five JON. We connect with people on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. That's right, we're on TikTok because we're cool. This last question, okay, this one's a personal one. It's asking about how are things here at Life Church after everything our church has gone through over the past 19 months. So I really appreciate that question. If you were to go back a number of episodes this year, I believe it was episode 48 back in February, I had a transparent episode of the podcast where I shared about the unique challenges that our church startup has faced during the pandemic. Not only were we shut down here in the state of Michigan, which had the strictest COVID shutdown rules, it just decimated small businesses and restaurants and churches. A number of churches in our area have closed permanently. But in the midst of it, we went through the heartbreak of a church staff insurrection, and they all resigned en masse and, went down the proverbial road and started a church, a Life Church 2.0, and took a huge chunk of people with them. And all the stories that you hear of churches that split, or there's some disagreement or miscommunication, and nobody wins in that situation. It's like going through a meat grinder. So this viewer, thanks for asking, is asking just how are things going here at the end of 2021? We're still here. We're still rocking and rolling. It's been a painful year and a half. But that's part of what you sign up for. When you sign up for leadership, you sign up to be misunderstood, and you sign up for challenges, and you sign up for heartache. Honestly, one of the hardest aspects that I've had to reconcile with is that I didn't see it coming. Like, nobody telegraphs to the lead pastor, hey, we're going to try and, hijack the ship here. You don't get a heads up. In fact, I didn't fully understand and realize what was happening until many months later. Nobody said, hey, we're going to go start a church, or definitely nobody asked for advice or for, our blessing or anything like that. And some people may hear that and say, wow, John is so naive. No, as a leader, I choose to believe the best about people and not assume the worst. And so when I ask someone who's on paid church staff and look them in the eye and say, hey, my spidey senses are tingling, is there anything I need to know, or is there something about this situation I need to know? And when they say, oh no, there's nothing there, you must be misperceiving the situation, I believe them. I don't assume that people are lying to me. And so that's how I didn't see it coming, is that people didn't shoot straight. They were very dishonest and deceiving. And that's how the enemy works, is through, in the dark, in the shadows, through whispers. The Proverbs talk about how careless whispers separate friends, gossip, making assumptions about people's intentions and character. That's the hard stuff. I was so busy during that season with COVID, with trying to hold our church community together, just like any other church leader. As I was grabbing buckets of water to put out fires, I turned around and expected my friends and my staff to be handing me more buckets of water, but instead I would turn around and only see more fires. And one of the principles that God has taught me in this is the friends that you have history with are not necessarily the friends you will make history with. And that's been the hardest lesson to embrace for my wife and I, because Life Church is a labor of love. We've sacrificed everything to start this church. We are missionaries. We came here and didn't know anybody. We had no money, no facility, no people, no clue when we started Life Church. We literally started from the ground up. And so every person matters. Every story matters. And only a lead pastor can understand the weight and the hurt when people you've led to Christ, or people you've baptized, people you've officiated their wedding, people that you've plucked out of obscurity and you said, I believe in you, and now they're in ministry, and for them to abruptly walk out of your life, and then to ghost you, to shun you, so you don't even know why. It's very, very painful. And factions happen. Factions can develop in any organization. It's the main tool of the enemy in short-circuiting a movement of God, is to develop a faction. A faction is when there is a pileup of disgruntled people who build up a case that becomes a driving fantasy. So factions are driven by the what if. Factions live their lives on something that has not happened. And so it takes great skill and patience to deal with factions. This is why we have therapists. That's why we have licensed counselors and psychologists. And sometimes with factions, we can't get resolution. If the other party is not willing to be open to the idea that they don't have all the information, or if they're not open to the idea of sitting down and talking, you can't have resolution. And so you just accept it. In leadership, you give up the right to be treated right. And so, it's been tough, because there are people who have anger toward me, that have anger toward our church, and I honestly have no idea why. But they're unwilling to sit and talk humbly about it, so there just won't be resolution. But what I do know is that anger is secondary to a hurt. So anger is the smoke. The fire is something deeper that's happening in their life. And when we are in pain, the body will sometimes choose anger. It'll choose a target, sometimes a scapegoat, because it numbs the pain. Anger numbs pain. And so the body gets hyped up when you're angry, and it can feel helpless. And this can lead to resentment and fear and anxiety. And then that can lead to paranoia. And this is what drives factions. It's the what if. It's building up a case driven by a fantasy. And it's really hard to move from paranoia to prudence. And when you're angry, you have to pause and remember that every feeling has a thought attached to it. So if my right to be treated right is violated, anger means that I'm choosing hostility and harshness. That's the law of the jungle. You hurt me, so I hurt you. Anger says hold a grudge. But that's not the way of Jesus. Jesus taught meekness. What does he say in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Meekness is the opposite of harshness. So gentle and kind is not natural. It's supernatural. So what Amber and I have been pressing into is we've been pressing into the gospel. When all your friends turn their backs on you, you can turn around and realize that Jesus is the friend that will never leave you. And God's supernatural work in your soul is to respond with meekness. Jesus, in Philippians 2, Jesus became meek rather than hostile. So you have to choose to give up your right to be treated right. You have to choose to not defend yourself. The Bible says over and over, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Your job, it says in Romans 13, is to live at peace with everyone as far as it is possible. You have to replace your right to be treated right with God's promises. And when you trust in God's promises, this leads to God's power in your life, including the resurrection of good things that come up out of the hurt and the heartache. My counselor said this to me. He said, don't fight. He said, don't fight for your natural rights, and watch God bless through his supernatural economy. So it's true. In church planting and leadership, you have to have a thick skin and a tender heart. Rather than point fingers, what I've tried to do this past year is to reach out, to, as Andy Stanley says, to put a welcome mat at our front door and to let everyone who is involved that I know of. I don't know who all is involved, but former staff certainly. I've reached out in multiple different ways: messages, text messages, cards, phone calls, and tried to make it clear that, hey, I love you. I don't understand this. I'm hurt, and I realize you're hurt. And so why don't we have coffee and talk about it humbly, and I'll listen. And so far, only one person has chosen to meet, and we had one meeting, and I tried to initiate a second meeting, and he didn't reply, and that's okay. I don't have to get a resolution. I know that my conscience is clear, and I know that I can't control what happens to me in life, but I can control how I react. I can own my mistakes. I can own the parts that I brought into this that were wrong, that were sinful, that, man, if I could go back in a time machine, I would do this differently. In fact, that's one thing I did in the summer is I felt very convicted by the Holy Spirit about the way that I talked to a former staff person in one conversation. I spoke in a very mean way, just an anti-pastoral way, and felt very convicted of sin and very guilty. And so I picked up the phone and called this former staff member, and I just honestly apologized for the way I had spoken to her in this conversation and asked for her forgiveness. And it was awkward to call her. It was scary because I didn't know, was she going to yell at me, or was she going to reject me, or what? And but I felt like God did a work in my heart. And and I feel like I did the right thing, the Jesus-honoring thing, not the law of the jungle, but the law of the gospel. The gospel compels me to go to the person privately, humbly, and if I'm wrong, to apologize, or if I don't understand, to seek understanding so that there can be reconciliation. Forgiveness is a decision. It's not a feeling. I don't feel like pursuing people who've walked away, but Jesus always walked toward people, not away. Jesus didn't hold a grudge. He held out a hand. Jesus chose conversation over condemnation. So this whole experience has deepened my awareness that I need the gospel every single day, that I am a sinner, that I am not a perfect leader, that I have many blind spots in my life that I'm working on, and that any, areas of sin or areas that need to be fixed, they have been addressed for sure, because that's all I can do is to better myself and to make changes in my life and in our organization so that we can more effectively serve and love people in the future. Do I hope for reconciliation? Absolutely. But I can't point fingers. I'm not in that season of life anymore. If I'm going to point fingers, it's going to be at the guy in the mirror. I'm going to say, wow, yeah, John is a knucklehead. He really screwed up on this, or he could have done better in that, or he miscommunicated here. But then at the end of the day, after I've addressed everything I can address, to stop beating myself up and realize that at the cross, Jesus took a beating for me. When there's factions in your organization, you don't need a battle plan. You need a grace plan. And realize that when people get angry, there's a pain underneath that anger. And that's where you want to serve. If people have hurts in their heart, if they have weeds in their heart, you can't help if you become the object of their blame. People blame and criticize to numb their pain. As a leader, you can't get defensive. You can't get mean. You can't withdraw. You have to depersonalize the attacks. Go to God and own what you need to own. Go to the person, or at least attempt. And I continue to keep reaching out to everyone that I know that's involved. I regularly message them, let them know I'm praying for them, let them know, I care about them, and my door is open. I will drop everything and meet with anyone, anywhere, anytime, because the gospel of reconciliation is so much more important than the success of my ministry. So that's what I pray for. I pray for forgiveness and reconciliation. That would be a story of God moving right there. So thank you for asking, and thank you for listening to me ramble on. Again, this is cheaper than therapy, but those are the things I'm learning. Extreme ownership. I have to own, at the end of the day, I have to own what happened and make changes in myself, in my leadership, in my organization, and then continue reaching out to these individuals. So yeah, one day I'll write that book. I think I'll call it, I Survived a Church Split, and You Can Too. I kid, because you can either laugh or cry, and I choose to try to find the humor in the situation. Well, that's it for the mailbag, the year-end mailbag. This has become a longer episode of the podcast than normal. So thanks for hanging in there. I do have a big announcement as we wind things down for 2021. The big announcement is this. This is the final episode of the Fearless Leadership Podcast. Now, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. In fact, this podcast will continue under a new name. One of the shifts that has happened in my life in the last 12 months, and certainly through this doctoral process, is I've gotten greater clarity on where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, and where my passions are. And I just am really passionate about equipping and encouraging and strengthening church leaders. For whatever reason, my background in improvisational comedy, crisscrossing with theology and church planting, that's my sweet spot. I love coaching and cheerleading other church leaders. I love teaching them, what has worked here at Life Church and what hasn't worked, And so the focus of this podcast is going to shift a bit as we head into 2022. It will no longer be called the Fearless Leadership Podcast. We're going to retire that name. Love that name, but it's a new season. It's a new day. And so the next episode will be the Church Growth Podcast. Still hosted by me, same theme music. The format will remain the same. Of part of the time, it's me teaching insanely practical tips on church growth, healthy church systems, and then also bringing you interviews with artists, with comedians who are fearlessly tackling the stage and leading people, and what can we learn. But the focus will definitely be geared more towards the nonprofit, entrepreneurial church leadership crowd. If that's not you, I hope you'll stay tuned in, because a lot of this is applicable wherever you live and lead. But just wanted to make that announcement. We become the Church Growth Podcast, beginning with the next episode 68. You don't have to do anything with your podcast feed. The name will automatically change. The artwork will eventually change. Just a new name, same old guy, Jonathan Herron here. And we'll have friends and guests along the way on the Church Growth Podcast. Listen, it would be an honor and a privilege to help coach, teach, and cheerlead you with our new 9-month coaching program. You can discover more at www.churchgrowth.network. It's a 9-month coaching program that includes one-on-one personal coaching, group teaching on Zoom, a brand new Double Your Church digital course, tons of resourcing, 12. We're going to go through the 12 systems of a healthy church so that you can double in size in the next 9 months. And I'm not just blowing air. This is coming from one of the fastest growing churches in America. I just feel a responsibility to share what God has taught us here. And it would be an honor and a privilege to be part of your journey. 50% off when you use the coupon code FEARLESS. Go to churchgrowth.network, coupon code FEARLESS for 50% off your 9-month coaching journey. Thank you so much for your support, for your love, for subscribing. If this episode has been helpful, do me a favor, leave a positive review on your favorite podcasting platform. Those 5-star reviews increase the algorithms and help us get in front of more eyeballs of more people like you. And we just want to help equip, encourage, and strengthen church leaders for time and eternity. Next episode, I am sitting down with an amazing church growth specialist, Lee Coate of Growmentum. He's also the executive pastor at The Crossing Church in Las Vegas, Nevada. And Lee has some amazing insights that are just going to rock your world. That's on the next episode of Church Growth Podcast. Make sure you're subscribed. Until then, have a Merry Christmas and enjoy your burrito.